Hey everybody, this is another one of those multiple game my thoughts on videos where the games in question I just don't really have all that much to say about, or the game in question is just so bare bones or minimal that a full video would just be kind of pointless for it. So instead I tend to bundle those together in a single video, and thus they still get covered on the channel, but it also doesn't take me quite as long to make the video as it would for, say, a normal review or a full-length MTO of a specific game. Now, we'll have time codes in the video description box to where you can take a look at my thoughts on the specific games that are covered in this video, but let's go ahead and start with the first one here, and we'll just go from there. Now, the first game I want to talk about here is called Party Hard. This is a stealth action game developed by Pinnacle Games and published by Tiny Build, and it is available for PC, Mac, Linux, Xbox One, PS4, iOS, and Android. And it was first released in August of last year, but it did see later on releases on multiple different systems. And my coverage of this is coming to you courtesy of Starforge, who sent me a copy of this. Thank you for that, it is greatly appreciated. And really the main reason it's in this collected MTO rather than a full review on its own is simply the fact that I don't really have all that much to say about it. It's a very simple game when you get down to it. And that simplicity even extends to the premise. You play as a guy who just wants to get some sleep, but it's 3 a.m. and his neighbors won't stop partying, so he whips out a hockey mask and he just goes to town. And that's really the game in a nutshell. It's just avoid getting captured while taking out every single character on the screen. It's really that simple. And one of the very first things you find out about this thing is that it does not take itself remotely seriously. Oh, don't be fooled by the intro bit where it's got this overly serious interview going on where a detective is being interviewed about the so-called Party Hard killings and his role in them and that sort of thing. But then you actually get into the game, and you find all sorts of weird, wacky, random events, like suddenly aliens out of nowhere, or zombies start creeping in from the bottom of the screen and then start infecting everybody, or all of a sudden a bear will get loose and just start annihilating everything. All kinds of really weird nonsense that is just plain silly. And the really bright, cartoony art style that is done entirely in pixel art does actually help to make it even sillier than it already is. The problem with that, of course, is that a lot of us, myself included, are just really tired of pixel art aesthetic, so even though they did a pretty good job with it, and there's a surprising amount of detail in the environments and things like that, it's just kind of tiring to have another game that has a pixel art aesthetic. Not really something that's a full-on detriment to the game, but definitely something that if you're tired of pixel art, then this isn't going to do you any favors. What little voice acting the game has is rather cheesy and very amateurish, so it oddly enough lends to the charm despite really not being all that high quality in terms of being voice acting. And while the sound effects merely suffice, the music just kind of steals the show as far as the presentation's concerned. It's entirely electronic music, and while it does get a bit repetitive toward the end of the game when you're having to constantly replay levels over and over and over again, it's really catchy music that is very fitting for the party vibe, and it's something that you can very easily just listen to on its own. Again, it is really catchy music, and it is really good music for what it is. But then you get to the story and the gameplay, and the story in this, again, is not really taking itself very seriously, even though it's acting like it's serious. And that really doesn't do all that much for the game, because it's just something that happens in between the levels, and it's a very short series of conversations where the detective being interviewed gets increasingly irritable, and the interviewee gets increasingly gleeful during the whole thing. And then there's the big reveal at the end, and it's something you basically can see coming from a mile away. Really not an impressive storyline at all, but it's not meant to be. What's meant to be more interesting is the gameplay itself, where again the objective is to eliminate every single character on the screen and not get caught while doing so. The controls are very simple. You have an attack button, you have an interact button, you have a dance button, and then you have a button to be able to pick up bodies and place them in other locations. The only other buttons are the run button, where you try to run faster but you can't really run very far until you run out of the meter and you start moving at normal speed again, and the use item button, where you can use an item that you've picked up throughout the course of playing through a level and do various things like, say, throw down a stun grenade or something along those lines in order to get an advantage. And the basic premise is to not get seen while you eliminate people, so you can use various traps that are scattered throughout the environment. Things like fire barrels or various things that you can drop on people, or vehicles that you can send scattering off to run over things, or any number of items like that that allow you to take out a bunch of NPCs at once. Some of them are available for a single use, some of them are available for multiple uses, and some of them are only available to take out a single character. Now, the stealth aspect comes in the fact that if you're caught by the authorities or a bouncer, then you're just immediately eliminated and you have to start the entire level over again. So in order to prevent that from happening, you have to prevent the partygoers from seeing the corpses, or you have to basically get away from them before anybody notices. It's easier said than done, particularly considering that the game doesn't really do a great job of showing you when somebody's about to spot you or not. It also seems really inconsistent with the amount of time that you'll get chased before the pursuer will just give up. Sometimes they'll follow you halfway across the map, sometimes they'll only follow you for a few steps before saying screw it and just running off and doing whatever else they were going to do. And sometimes things are just wildly unpredictable and you'll get a random event that comes in and just instantly kills you and you had no idea what just happened. Add to that the Twitch integration, which allows Twitch chat to mess around with your game by voting on various events and letting those happen just out of nowhere and thus screwing you over. And you end up with a game where a lot of it really comes down to luck of the draw. Are you lucky enough to have everything fall in your favor or not fall in your favor? This means that either a level can be very easy or it can be very, very difficult, and more often than not it tends to fall more towards the difficult side of things. Particularly when you get later on into the game and it starts introducing more and more bouncers, among other things, to just get in your way constantly and have you restart the levels over and over and over again. And with that kind of difficulty comes very large amounts of frustration, and for some people that's going to be right up their alley. For others, like myself, it just got really annoying after a while. But really, it's very hard to escape the idea that this was made for streamers and YouTubers to just make a bunch of goofy videos and streams about. And it really does lend itself very well towards that. Every play session is going to be very short because the levels themselves don't really last any more than a few minutes at a time, and you're looking at a game that's maybe a couple of hours long if you were able to get through every single level in sequence. It's really the difficulty and the general silliness that are going to keep you coming back to it, and that's really where the appeal is going to lie. The thing is that YouTubers and streamers are always looking for that kind of thing because it's entertaining to stream and make videos about, because then you get a chance to just make a silly video or have a stream where your chat is very entertained by you constantly failing at everything. And that's really this game in a nutshell. Those of you looking for a really compelling stealth game might want to look elsewhere, because the stealth mechanics in this are extremely simplistic and really not explained all that well in the actual confines of the game. But if you're looking for something that has very short play sessions that are generally rather difficult and occasionally are downright frustrating, then this might be right up your alley. But I personally didn't really get much out of it, and its appeal is going to be rather limited simply because it's really not aiming for a general audience. Next up is Punch Club, which is a sort of tycoon management kind of game developed by Lazy Bear Games and published also by Tiny Build in January of this year. And it entails the story of a guy whose father was murdered before his eyes, and thus he must train and then beat the crap out of a bunch of people. And that's pretty much it, really. And quite honestly, I do not give a single solitary crap about the rest of the storyline because the gameplay in this is unbelievably monotonous. Before we get there though, let's first talk about the presentation, which is bright, colorful, cartoony pixel art. I've seen a trend here with pixel art, right? But this is actually rather detailed pixel art, and generally speaking, it's very well done. The interface is nice and clean, it's easy to work with, and it's very obviously made for a touchscreen because all of the buttons are rather large and very easy to hit. The sound design is considerably messier, however, because you have a soundtrack that is completely forgettable, and it's to the point where I actually had to go back and listen to the music again just to remember what it was in the first place. And what it is chiptunes. It sounds like it's something from the 16-bit era, which is pretty much what you would expect given the art style. It is very repetitive music though, so there is that. And there's no voice acting in this thing either, so whenever somebody's talking, you hear a sort of rumbling noise that's rendered in 16-bit, and it's really not not impressive at all. Again, fitting for the aesthetic, but completely forgettable. But then you get to the gameplay, and the gameplay in this is painfully dull. As I mentioned before, you must train in order to get better so you can beat more dudes in order to get better and beat more dudes. That's seriously all this game is. You train, you fight, you train, you fight. And it is very disproportionate in the amount of training versus the amount of fighting. Training involves basically going to the gym, paying your entrance fee, and then clicking on various machines until it starts to become inefficient to train on that particular machine. Then you click on another machine, and you do that exercise for a while until, again, it becomes inefficient. Then you move on to the next one until eventually you either run out of energy or you get hungry, in which case you go and you go back to your house in order to either sleep in order to get more energy back, or to get food from your fridge in order to fill your hunger meter. Then you go to work in order to fill up a meter, in order to get money, so you can either use the bus to get to places instantly, or you can pay entrance fees for the gym, or pay for food. And you're seeing where this would become a problem already, right? Outside of the fights, the entire game is nothing but filling up meters so you can fill up other meters. And when you get to the next day, you find that your stats actually decrease over time because you lose the gains that you made if you don't continuously upgrade your stats. Now, they did introduce an easy mode patch in November that removes the stat decay for the easy mode, but the stat decay remains on both of the other modes. And quite frankly, that is the biggest problem the game has, is that constant stat decay. It means that you're basically grinding so you can grind some more, and then when you actually get to the fights, it is laughable. You have basically no control over what's happening throughout the course of a fight. It just plays out automatically based on random chance. All you do is, before the fight begins, you select the moves that are available to you and you select your general tactic for fighting, and then at different intervals during the different rounds, you can switch up your abilities and your strategy in order to apparently get the upper hand, I think. At least I'm pretty sure that's the idea, and unfortunately that doesn't really jive well with the game mechanics because you have to unlock all of your moves and strategies by winning fights and getting upgrade points that you can then spend to buy various abilities and tactics. Basically, you grind in order to be able to grind some more, so that you can go into a fight that you have barely any control over whatsoever, that is just literally you sitting there watching it unfold, not having any real role in the actual fight itself other than picking a bunch of options and just letting it play out on its own, in order to get upgrade points so you can get more moves, so you can fight some more, but then your entire gameplay loop is grinding to that point. It is pure monotony. This game is literally nothing but grinding for the sake of grinding. And I hate grinding in video games. I hate doing it for an actual reason, like leveling up so I can beat a boss, for example. I hate it even more when it still has a point, but it is forced on me, and I hate it the absolute most when there is literally no point to the game other than the grind. As a result, this game is so monotonous and so boring that it actually pisses me off. If there was actual strategy behind the fighting, if you actually had some degree of input during the fight, then it might be somewhat worth it. But as it stands, it is just grinding so you can grind some more, so you can just sit there and watch things happen. That is not remotely enjoyable. I can't even manage to recommend it as a time waster on a mobile device. It's not even worth that. If you don't already own the game because you got it in a bundle or because you were suckered into getting it, then just avoid it. Next up is Tiki Man, which was developed by Anarchy Enterprises and released in June of last year. This particular part of the video is coming to you courtesy of Grotnod. He sent me this, so thank you for that. It is greatly appreciated. But Tiki Man, I have basically the least to say out of all of these because look at it. This is literally the entire game right here. You just alternate back and forth, left and right, because you're trying to avoid the arms of the Tiki in order to knock out the various bits of Tiki until you get high score. That's the entire game right there. No multiplayer, no alternate modes, you just chop at the Tiki until you eventually get the highest score you could possibly manage, and that's literally it. Do I even need to talk much about the art style? I mean, it's pixel art, it's very clearly designed around mobile devices, and there's basically no detail to anything whatsoever. Well, I guess at least it's bright and colorful. Then of course there's the sound, which is all 8-bit-ish sound effects, and a single loop of music throughout the entire game. To say this is repetitive is a massive understatement. This is the definition of a time waster game, and it's really not even very good at that, because the absolute most time you can waste in this is a matter of minutes before you say, why did I even get this in the first place, and then you just move on to something else. Speaking of moving on, let's move on into Might and Magic Clash of Heroes, which is primarily a puzzle game, but it's a puzzle adventure game with some very light RPG elements that was originally released for Nintendo DS in December of 2009, and later saw release on Xbox 360, PlayStation 3, PC, iOS, and Android. And what you're seeing here is, of course, the PC version. This was developed by Capybara Games and published by Ubisoft, and it's kind of an oddball. I mean, when you think of Might and Magic, you think of party-based old-school RPGs like the mainline Might and Magic 1 through 10 and all that. You think of sort of light strategy games mixed with RPG elements like the Heroes of Might and Magic franchise, and you think of even some action-adventure or action RPG kind of stuff like Dark Messiah of Might and Magic or Crusaders of Might and Magic. You don't immediately jump to, hey, I think of puzzle games, and that's precisely what this is. It's just, again, it's an anomaly in the entire franchise, and that goes for both its actual gameplay design as well as its visuals. It's practically an anime art style. It's not quite there, but it's pretty close to it. It is very, very bright and colorful, and it's actually got some pretty decent artwork here and there. Some of it is a bit messy, but the vast majority of the artwork, particularly with the unit sprites, is actually very well done. It's primarily the dialogue portraits that can be rather hit or miss because they're not really animated, and on top of that, some of them are a bit lower res, so they have a bit jagged edges, and they also can have some rather odd expressions on the characters sometimes. But all the other stuff, the environments and the units in particular, look rather well detailed for what they are, which is fairly low res sprite work. Now, of course, it's not really something you could get away with if you were, for example, doing the Heroes of Might and Magic series, or especially the mainline Might and Magic series. But for something like this, it actually ends up working out pretty well in the long run. And the sound design actually helps this out a fair bit, because the music in this is rather well done orchestral tracks that fit in very well with the vibe, and definitely feel like they fit in pretty well with the Might and Magic series as a whole. Where things get a lot messier is in the actual continuity with the main series, as well as the gameplay, which has basically nothing at all to do with any of the other Might and Magic games. In terms of series continuity, this is actually a prequel to Heroes of Might and Magic 5, and it's set roughly 40 years before the events of Heroes 5. And several of the characters from Heroes 5 do make appearances here, like, for example, Godric and Anwin. But the general vibe that you get from the storytelling and the character design in Clash of Heroes as opposed to the Heroes series is that this one is a lot more optimistic, shall we say. The Heroes series can get fairly dark at times, not horribly so, but it does get somewhat dark every so often, and while occasionally that sort of thing does happen in Clash of Heroes, most of the time it's a pretty standard hero story. There's a demon lord doing demon lord things behind the scenes to eventually cause chaos in Ashan, and of course your heroes have to stop him from doing that. And of course, for all of the heroes, this is their first big adventure, their first taste of heartbreak on this kind of scale, and it's kind of hopelessly generic. It's not the worst plot I've ever seen or anything of that nature, but it's definitely not something that's really going to keep you interested. It's something that just holds the game together and enables you to get more into the gameplay, which is what's really going to keep you coming back to it. It is a puzzle battle game where you're ultimately trying to defeat the enemy by matching various colors of units. You can, of course, match them vertically or horizontally. The thing is that, unlike in most puzzle games like this, you actually have to worry about the enemy being able to attack you versus being able to defend yourself and reach out and attack them as well. If you match your units vertically, then they actually go into attack formation, and after a certain number of turns, they will attack the enemy in order to, of course, take out units of their own side, as well as, if they manage to get past all those units, or there aren't any units in the first place, do damage directly to the enemy hero. If you match your units horizontally, on the other hand, they'll actually turn into walls in order to be able to block damage. And you have to combine these different aspects, building walls as well as building unit attacks in order to be able to defeat the enemy. Each character also has a special ability that they can use once they've generated enough mana, which is generated by actually taking damage. Once your mana meter has filled up, you can activate your special ability, which can be anything from creating a barrier between your hero and the enemy attacks, to things like actually just directly attacking their units, or directly attacking the hero themselves. This means that not only are you simply trying to match the various units to actually complete the puzzles, but you're trying to do it in a rather strategic manner, and it gives it a lot more depth than your average puzzle game. You're having to worry about chaining attacks together, or chaining different moves together in order to build up a large amount of defenses in one particular location, or set up something for later that you can't quite get to in that particular turn, because you only have a limited number of actions available to you, and one of those actions can be to replenish your units. You have an infinite supply of the basic unit types, but elite units, like, say, dragons, are something that require not only a different kind of reinforcement to be able to activate, but they also have higher turn counts for their attacks, and they also can only be used a limited number of times, however many they actually got in your specific army. Now in the campaigns, this is determined by the amount that you have actually purchased by finding them at the various shops throughout the world and actually just buying the certain number of them that you feel like you need for any given engagement, but they're randomly provided to you in the quick battle mode, so just keep that in mind, that you're actually going to need to replenish your elite units as you go through the course of the campaigns, but not so much in the normal quick battle mode, because you just have everything generated on the spot there. And it's worth noting that the elite units actually have special abilities that they enact whenever they actually attack. So for example, one of the dragons will spit acid on the ground that will cause damage over time. Or a demon unit might actually incinerate an enemy, leaving a burning pile behind that you actually can't put a unit into. So there's actually a pretty surprising amount of depth available in this thing. Even though it is a puzzle game, it's a puzzle game that is mixed with some pretty strong strategy elements that all ends up making it a surprisingly compelling game. Even if the plot doesn't really get you and the characters are fairly generic, the gameplay itself is actually strong enough to keep you coming back to it, at least if what you're interested in is a puzzle game. Thing is that puzzle games really aren't my thing, so while this is a pretty good example of one, and I would actually recommend it if you're looking to get a game in that particular genre, or you're looking to complete your Might and Magic collection or something along those lines, it's just not really my cup of tea. And last but not least, we have Tennis in the Face, a game by 10 Tons Limited that is basically a sort of physics-based puzzle game where you smack tennis balls and hit people in the face with them. And it's very cartoony and very silly. The devs actually sent me a copy of this to take a look at, and had they not done that, I probably wouldn't have covered this game at all, simply because it's just not my thing. I don't like physics-based puzzle games. I don't like puzzle games in general, really. And when you get down to it, this one's no exception. It's not that it's a bad game or anything. Again, it's just not my thing. You whack tennis balls and you cause wacky physics things to happen. You knock dudes out by getting headshots or just smacking them with the tennis ball in general. There's a variety of characters, each with their own gimmicks, and there's a variety of obstacles in the environment that also have their own gimmicks, and you basically control things by angling the tennis ball, or in later parts of the game you actually get cans of an energy drink called Explodes, which is basically what you're fighting against throughout the entirety of the game. You're fighting against this evil corporation that sells a particularly volatile energy drink, and it's ridiculous. But anyway, the cans go in an arc, whereas the tennis balls go in a straight line, and they tend to ricochet much more readily than the cans do. and eventually the cans will explode, sending a bunch of stuff flying all over the place. And this is one instance where the artwork and the sound design generally fits in pretty well, because obviously what's going on in this thing is rather silly, and what they've gone with is a very bright, colorful, cartoony art style that actually works out pretty well for the game in the long run. Especially when you consider this as a game primarily meant for mobile devices, so iOS, Android, that sort of thing, and it was only ported to PC later on. That art style really does help in that particular instance. And that extends to the sound design as well. It's got a fairly decent soundtrack that's mostly forgettable, but within the confines of the game it works out fairly well. And you've got sound effects that are suitably cartoony and goofy for what's going on. But there's really no voice acting to speak of, and it really does fall to the gameplay to bring things up, because the story is pretty much non-existent. It's basically that you're a tennis player whose life was ruined by explodes, so you go and try to stop explodes. And of course the only way you know how to do that is, well, you're a tennis player, so obviously you're going to whack tennis balls at things. And it's just some goofy, cartoony nonsense that is basically good for a quick time waster. And I can see where in mobile games that would work rather well, and I could see this working rather well as a mobile game because it's simple, it's easy to pick up, and generally speaking it's rather easy to play. And you don't really have to worry about playing it for long periods of time because every play session is going to be rather short. The thing is that if you're playing it on PC, chances are that you're really not the kind of person who's going to want to play a game like this on your PC. It's going to be the kind of thing that you're going to want to play on your mobile device because you just want to kill a few minutes. And that's perfectly fine if you want to play it on a mobile device because that's where it really does fit in rather well, but on PC it's a much harder sell, and it's also competing with other games of its type, and I can't really see much reason to recommend it over those. It's not really to say that the game's bad or anything, it's certainly not. It does have its issues, namely the fact that sometimes the physics of the tennis balls are a bit unpredictable, where they'll just go careening off in a direction you didn't think they'd go. But other than that, there's really nothing outright wrong with the game, it's just that there's not really much reason to play it over any of the other games of its type out there, unless you just think that the theme is rather amusing. So if you do think that the theme is rather amusing, you might be able to get quite a bit more out of it than I did, but generally speaking, I don't really get much out of these types of games, and this one really wasn't any exception. And it really doesn't help that there's really not a huge amount of replay value in a game like this, to where once you figure out the solution to a particular puzzle, well, you're just going to be able to do that and optimize it only slightly more before you finally get to the most optimal solution. It does, of course, have Steam achievements and trading cards and things like that, so if that's your kind of thing, then you might want to take a look at it, but I, again, really can't recommend Tennis in the Face much at all, other than the fact that, hey, it's kinda silly and amusing for at least a few minutes. And let's face it, you could do a hell of a lot worse for time waster games than this. And there you have it, folks. My thoughts on 5 different games that I didn't really think would be optimal for individual videos. Sorry about the delay in getting this video up. I was expecting to get this thing done by Saturday the 3rd, but it turned out to take quite a bit longer than that just to get everything edited together. But I want to go ahead and get these done so I could, of course, free up a bit of disk space, but also so I could focus more on some games that are taking up a lot more of my time and energy, like what I'll be reviewing this coming Saturday, so stay tuned for that. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed the content for this particular video, and I will catch you all in later videos.